There is so much to admire about our next guest. I could fill a stadium with superlatives about this great American woman. To distill it down to this simple but quite impactful fact seems appropriate, though. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe released Uncle Tom's Cabin. Within a year, it rivaled the Bible for published sales. Ladies and gentlemen, join me please in a grand, warm welcome to Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Thank you, sir. Thank you kindly. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. I was born on June the 14th of 1811 in a town called Litchfield, Connecticut. My father was Lyman Beecher. He was a very prominent First Congregational minister. My mother's name was Roxana Foote. She was not as well known as my father, but she had one small claim to fame. She was actually the granddaughter to the great General Andrew Ward, who served under George Washington in the American Revolution. I was the 7th child born into the Beecher family, having 3 older brothers and 3 sisters. Unfortunately, the sister who preceded me, whose name was also Harriet, she died shortly after birth. So when I came around, my parents decided to give me the same name. It was said that my father was so disappointed upon hearing the news that I was born a female that he went down the road a spell to complain to a neighbor. He said, "Oh, well, it's another girl. I guess we'll just name her Harriet, too. How I do wish she was a boy." I know that might sound rather harsh, a father to say such things, but actually I understood it entirely. You see, my father was a minister, and it would be the destiny of all of his sons to become ministers as well. When I was growing up, women could not publicly speak. We couldn't even lead a prayer in the churches. So maybe you better understand why my father wanted boys. The eldest sibling I had was my sister Catherine. And when I was 6 years old, my mother passed away, and Catherine decided to leave Litchfield, and she moved to Hartford, Connecticut. A few years later, she opened the first women's college there. She called it the Hartford Female Seminary. She solicited my sister Mary to teach with her at the seminary, and well, the first year was rather dismal. They had only 7 pupils. But by year number 2, they had 25, and I was one of them. Now, I had been attending the college for only a couple of short years when my sister Catherine got the notion that I needed to join the ranks of the teaching staff. This was not my idea whatsoever. I was 14 years old. But once Catherine got a notion, there was no turning back. So my first assignment was to teach theology, biblical studies. And that's when the Depression somewhat set in. You see, I was the youngest girl in the college, and the shortest one, too. I barely reached 5 feet tall. And I was teaching girls who were older than I, and in my opinion, much smarter than I was as well. Not only that, but I had difficulty making friends. I had no confidence in myself, and well, anyway, that depression continued for about 7 years. But in 1832, my father, he landed the position of president at Lane Theological Seminary, which happened to be in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, all my life, from the time I was a little girl, I grew up listening to these horrific stories about the treatment of the slaves. Listening to my father as he would preach on the pulpit, with tears streaming down his face. But you see, Father was not an abolitionist, no. Rather, he was in favor of something called colonization. Now, to remind you, colonization was the idea that all of the slaves needed to be relocated to Africa to form their own colonies and essentially have their freedom. It was a popular idea in those days, but one that I could not abide by. Another person who was instrumental in helping me form my opinion was my Aunt Mary. This was my mother's sister. Aunt Mary was married to a farmer, and they had a plantation in Jamaica. And they had slaves working there on the farm. And Aunt Mary was opposed to the way they were being treated as well. And she told her husband if things did not improve, that she was going to come back to America. Well, things did not improve. And Aunt Mary was a woman of her word, so she did come back to America without him.
Ooh.
Now, as I said, Cincinnati was on the edge of the West and of the South. But it was also at the crossroads between the North and the South. And if you lived there, you had to decide which side you were on. There was no room for middle ground. You were either an abolitionist opposed to slavery, or you were in favor of it. That was it. And the reality looked you in the face each and every day. Go down a path, and it was easy to see these notices that would be nailed into the trees. They would be offering hefty rewards for the capture and return of runaway slaves. Go down a little further to the water and you would see boats. And the boats had chained black slaves. Everybody knew, heading south, going to the auction block. And through it all, temperaments were flaring as well. Now, Calvin and I were raising our children at that time. I had 4 children in 4 years. My first were a set of twins. I named them Harriet and Eliza. 2 years later came my son Henry Alice, and the year after Henry was born, my son Frederick was born. Well, now, as you can imagine, I was a very busy mother. I had little time for myself. But Calvin wasn't making much money there at the college, and I knew the only way I could supplement the income was if I picked up my pen and I started writing again. Well, I wasn't writing anything of any great importance, just some humorous sketches, short stories. That was all about 1842, and that's when the first tragedy befell my family. My brother George, who I had always been so close with, he had joined a group called the Perfectionists, and I had no idea how depressed he had become. He took his own life. I was carrying a child at the time, and I thought perhaps this child would be born a boy. I'd name him George. The child was born female. I named her Georgiana May. Well, now I had 5 mouths to feed as children, and 6 years just seemed to fly away in the blink of an eye. The year now is 1848, and that's when another tragedy befell us. In 1847, cholera had reached epidemic proportions, and although many of us in the Beecher family got sick, it was just my youngest son, Samuel Charles, who succumbed to cholera. And he was only 18 months old. I don't think anyone can really identify with what goes on in a woman's mind when she loses a child, and I certainly was never prepared for it myself. Well, Calvin thought that I would go right back into a depression, and he wanted to save me, so he surprised me, and he landed a position at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. While everyone else was moving westward, we were going to go back east, back to New England. I thought that's what I needed, a change of scenery, a change of life. I was 38 years old, and I had spent 17 years of my life in Cincinnati, and now I was ready for something new. But you know something? I didn't realize something at that time. I didn't realize that my life was being determined for me in Washington, D.C. You see, in Washington, D.C., something called the Fugitive Slave Act was being debated. The federal government was always finding itself embroiled in heated arguments between the North and the South. And when California wanted to enter the Union as a free state, The Southern states were up in arms. They said they were sick and tired of all the anti-slavery propaganda being forced down their throats. And they warned if California entered the Union as a free state, then the Southern states would secede. They'd leave the Union, and we would be on the brink of a civil war. There would be 3 political statesmen who would head up this debate. John C. Calhoun, he would represent the South. Daniel Webster, he would represent the North. And Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, also known as the Great Compromiser. Twice before, Henry Clay had saved the Union when it teetered on the brink of secession. But now all 3 of these men, you see, were at the end of their careers. And they were passionate over the issue of slavery. They were ready to speak their mind and leave their mark. Calhoun spoke first, and he maintained if California entered the Union as a free state, then the Southern states would need equal rights in all the new territories. And a restraint would have to be placed on the North when it came to dealing with issues of slavery. Now, Henry Clay offered many concessions for the South, but he was opposed to the Fugitive Slave Act. If you remember, the Fugitive Slave Act was the act that would give the federal government the opportunity to catch the runaway slaves and then return them to their masters. It would even give people incentive to help the government with this process by putting a price tag on the slave's head. This was all in 1850. As you can imagine, it would become a very powerful debate. Daniel Webster, our hero from New England, the man who openly opposed Calhoun, who would be best remembered for shouting, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Well, on March 7th, Daniel Webster stood on the Senate floor, and he agreed with all of Clay's compromises. But he shocked our world when he decided to endorse the Fugitive Slave Act. Of course, I reacted as many of my fellow Northerners did. We felt betrayed. The Fugitive Slave Act would make us an accessory to slavery. We would be participating in its survival, cooperating in a sin. Well, this was not a law, not yet. If it was to become a law, it would take several months. In July of that year, I had another son, Charles Edward, the final child I would bear in my lifetime. But you see, cholera was still running rampant. Why, even the president, Zachary Taylor, he succumbed to cholera the day after my little Charlie was born. And now the new president was a man by the name of Millard Fillmore. What did we know about him? Just that he was coming from New York. Would he endorse the Fugitive Slave Act or oppose it? In September of that year, we got our answer when Mr. Fillmore decided to endorse the Fugitive Slave Act and it became law. People celebrated. Everyone was so happy there would be no war. Of course I was happy there would be no war. I didn't want a war, nobody would. But I could not celebrate. At that point in time, I just needed to be kept busy. Oh, you're probably thinking, didn't you have enough of that at home with those children? And you'd be right. But I picked up my pen and I started writing again. I dabbled in a little poetry and some short stories. But you see, no matter what I wrote, it felt as if I was rowing my boat against the tide and the wind. My house was so noisy. The children demanded my attention, and yet this issue of slavery had just weighed down upon my shoulders as a personal one. I became angry. I was angry at the churches. They were so powerful, yet they sat back and they did absolutely nothing. And then I became frustrated. And the one person who shared equally in my frustration was my sister-in-law, Isabella. She was married to my brother Edward. They lived in Boston. One day I received a letter from Isabella And in her letter, she shared with me her own frustration over the Fugitive Slave Act, and I remember it said, "My dearest Hattie, if I could use a pen as you, I would write something to make this entire nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is." And that was a defining moment for me. At that moment, everything just came into focus. I knew what I had to do. I had to write a book. And it would have to be a very, very powerful book because, you see, slavery, it was not only a moral issue, it was a political issue. And I knew I would meet with a great deal of criticism. People would say, "Who is that 5-foot woman from New England? What does she know about slavery? How dare she attack it?" But you see, I knew a lot. Every place I lived, I interviewed people, slave owners, slave traders, slaves themselves, abolitionists. I had all these stories in my head, just waiting to be penned into words on a page in a book. But there was one thing I lacked: confidence. So I went to my brother Henry Ward. He was the brother whose opinion I valued so highly, and I told him my idea for the book, and he took me by the arms. He looked me squarely in the eyes. He said, "Harriet, just do it." That's all I needed to hear. 1 month later, I was sitting in a church. It was a rainy, very cold Sunday morning, and I was looking out the window, and I had a vision. In my mind, I saw this elderly black slave mercilessly being beaten to his death by his master and 2 lackeys. And that image was so clear, I went home and I frantically began to write. I wrote on every piece of white paper that I could find. When I ran out of white paper, I wrote on brown wrapping paper. I wrote the character of Uncle Tom and his master, Simon Legree. And Simon Legree had to be from New England. That was very important to the book, because it showed that slavery was not just a Southern evil. It was a national one. And it would take all of us coming together as a nation to finally see it be abolished once and for all. At that moment, I wrote the ending of the book before I wrote anything else. And then while I still had the gumption inside of me and the fire burning, and I found one last clean piece of white paper, I wrote to Dr. Bailey. He was the editor of the National Era, a very prominent abolitionist newspaper. And I told Dr. Bailey in the letter about my idea for the book. I even sent him a sample. And I warned him if he was interested in this book, it might take several installments before it would be complete. 1 month later, I received a letter from Dr. Bailey and a check for $300. And in his letter, he said, "I anxiously await the arrival of your book." I sometimes reflect upon all those people who had so much influence helping me with that story. And I know I mentioned my father to you as he preached on the pulpit. There were a couple more too. Aunt Mary, she would hang in the hammock right over our kitchen table and share stories with us. But there was a third person I need to tell you about, and her name was Eliza Buck. Eliza herself was a slave, a former slave, and she was married to a slave. And Calvin and I hired Eliza to help us with some of the domestic chores around the house and the children. And I found she was so filled with stories and so eager to tell me. At night, while the children would be tucked in their beds, Eliza and I would sit up by candlelight, and I would pour her tea, and she would pour out the stories. And she spoke fast, so much so I had to write every word she said down without any punctuation whatsoever. The first installment of the book came out in the National Era, and it was entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Man Who Was a Thing. I wanted that subtitle for the book because it showed that slavery did not look upon the black human race as a people. Rather, they looked upon the black human race as property. Cows, pigs, ducks, chickens, you name it. Some of the editors had issue with the subtitle. It went through several revisions. And then we agreed on one. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life Among the Lowly. I remember the day I finished writing the book. It was almost as if I had gained my own liberation. And I got down on my knees and I prayed that that book would bring peace to our nation. And then selfishly, I prayed for enough money to buy myself a silk dress. Some people attribute me as writing the first protest novel in America. They say Uncle Tom's Cabin was the first book to publicly denounce slavery. But I must confess something to all of you. I did not write the book. God wrote the book. I simply did his dictation. And I knew that book would bring me much criticism, and I was right. At first, the southern states, they just ignored it, and they started calling it fiction. And as more and more people called it fiction, it agitated me terribly. I knew I had to write a second book. So I set about the arduous task of writing a second book I would entitle The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I knew it would be difficult, but I had no idea the magnitude of difficulty this particular book brought into my life. The book was published in 1854, and it met with a modest reception, very much unlike its predecessor. But I was determined to write a novel a year after that, and I stayed on track for a couple of years. But in 1857, we got word that our son, Henry Ellis, he was a freshman at Dartmouth College. He drowned in a tragic swimming accident while crossing the Connecticut River. And once again, we had to bury a son. Well, after that happened, I went into a little bit of a depression, and Calvin knew I needed to get away for a while, so he suggested that I go on holiday, and I chose England as the place I wanted to go. When I returned, it was 1860, and our country teetered on the brink of war. Everything just seemed to hang in that next presidential election. In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was voted into office, South Carolina seceded, and then quickly 6 more states followed suit. I'm certain Mr. Lincoln did not want to have a civil war under his presidency, but it was really out of his hands, wasn't it? When General Beauregard decided to fire on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, and that war began. I had several relatives that fought in the war. Even my own son Frederick enlisted, much to my dismay. And those of us who couldn't fight, we were very vocal on the sidelines. But you see, the North wasn't doing well at all, especially in the beginning, and I didn't understand the philosophy of Mr. Lincoln. He had the power to free the slaves, but he wasn't doing it. I knew the only way that I would get some satisfaction is if I could meet him face to face. So I wrote him a letter, and I asked him if he would grant me counsel, and he graciously accepted. I traveled to Washington with my daughter Hattie and my young son Charlie and my sister-in-law Isabella. I thought I was so prepared for this meeting. I had all my questions lined up on a long piece of paper, and I was planning on debating the great debater himself. Yes, I thought I was prepared. But But when he stepped into the room, I realized that was not the case. I think it was his eyes that gave him away. In his eyes, he held the sorrow of our world. And when he spoke, it came right from his heart. He stepped into the room. He extended this rather long, ungainly arm out toward me, and he took my hand. He looked me in the eyes and he said, "So this is the little woman who wrote the book that started this big war." We spoke for quite a while, and I asked him all my questions. And he answered with a sincerity that I had never experienced before or since. My opinion of Mr. Lincoln changed greatly after that. Well, needless to say, the war continued. We got word in 1865 that our son Frederick actually was injured at one of the battles in Gettysburg. And Calvin wanted so desperately to find him. But he was pickpocketed on the train, so he had to abort his mission. But I'm happy to tell you that my son Frederick found his way to our home, and I was able to nurse all of his physical wounds, just not his mental ones. And when he walked out of our door, it would be the last time we would see our son Frederick. And we never had any closure on that one. But on a much brighter note, in 1865, in April that is, we got word that, we were planning actually, that we wanted to have a big celebration for our daughter Georgiana May's wedding. And we got word we couldn't have it where we wanted it, so we decided we were going to have it in our backyard. And we got word that day that the South surrendered, and that war was over. I was 54 years old when the war ended, and I would go on to live 31 more years. I would write 30 books, 10 were novels, and enough material, they say, that fills 16 volumes. I was a 5-foot woman from New England. I was a wife and a mother. And yet God chose me to write a book that would put a face on slavery. A book that could show the human and the inhuman aspect of all of it. My dearest friends, we can all make a difference in our world, each and every one of us. No one would say it would ever be easy. It takes courage. It takes persistence as well. And in my humble opinion, it also takes a very strong faith in God. Thank you so kindly.